Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy. I'll be your moderator. Today, our guest is Leena Pivovarova. She's an analyst and consultant from NSR, and we are recording this live from the floor of the SmallSat conference in lovely downtown Logan, Utah. All kinds of different space people here, small satellite people, military folks, people from Australia. It's a real fun conference here, and maybe get a chance to come down there. During this particular episode, we'll talk about new developments and strategies in the small sat industry, with emphasis on new launch and propulsion technologies, and how ground systems have to adapt to support mega constellations. Today, we have Leena Pivovarova, analyst at NCR, we mentioned that earlier, and she's been at the forefront of small sat launch and new space industries since 2013. So it's only appropriate that she's at the small sat conference. Well, pleased to have you with us today. You know, the small sat industry has been experiencing rapid growth. The expansion of this conference is just being one indicator. There are thousands of people here. So, Leena, do you expect to see a consolidation in the market? What do you see is going on?
Thanks for having me today, John. So when speaking about small sats, we should probably define that as there's various definitions within the industry. The definition that NSR uses is any satellite below 500 kilograms. So, once we're with that, we're seeing increasing competition in both launch and marketing services. That's leading to some sort of consolidation and M&Is in the market. Some of that is already happening. So there's, I wouldn't say that there's a trend, but there's definitely some indicators in the market already. So talking about launch first, there are many new actors of all sizes coming to market. So we're talking heavy launch vehicles, we're talking, small light launchers, small sat launchers, dedicated ones. And so one of the examples of, M&A in the market is strategic partnerships and investments like what we saw with Lockheed Ventures investing in Able Space Technologies, which is a small startup that is developing a light launcher, which is really, really cool. And then moving on to the manufacturing segment, same kind of a trend there. There is increasing competition. We're seeing a lot of actors across the small sat industry bringing their manufacturing in-house, which results in increased competition overall. And so the other thing that's really important to note here is that the business cases are not as clear-cut or stable as they used to be. So they're starting to kind of employ new methods. So we saw, I believe it was late 2018, with Boeing purchasing Millennium Engineering. So that's another good indicator of consolidation in the market. So, but also important to talk about the motivation for the consolidation that we're expecting to see in the market and already seeing. So, for example, on one side, established actors like, in this case, Lockheed or Boeing want to get involved in newer verticals, kind of cutting-edge technologies that they may not have been involved in before by acquiring a new startup or a company kind of on the forefront of those verticals. And so it's easier to do this, kind of not organically, but by already having a foot in the door with the kind of a scrappy startup situation.
I've got 3 kids who are in their 20s, and we argue a lot about everything under the sun. And I use this phrase, there's a difference without a distinction, or distinction without a difference. So when it comes to terminology with small sats, CubeSat, nanosat, are these really worth differentiating between, or is this just proprietary that a company makes and wants to no, this is a nanosat? Or are there actually categories?
Well, I think in our business it really is important to differentiate because there are so many different trends that you can kind of cut the data through and see. I mean, lots of people are interested in specifically CubeSats and the evolution of that. Other folks are interested in kind of bigger satellites and, other orbits, and so it really depends.
4 days ago, I was sitting in Long Beach eating fish tacos. Great, by the way. And there's a big manufacturing presence in there with some of the large manufacturers, space manufacturers. Are there geographic locations, either nationally or internationally, where these satellites are starting to be made or trending to be made?
That's a very interesting question. I know I can speak specifically in the United States. I think Seattle is a pretty big hub there. It's got a lot of space presence, I think. Of course, there's also Silicon Valley. LA is another really big hotspot. We see smallsats and launch vehicles being headquartered there. And also, of course, Florida, the Cape is rising again. So
there's a surprising segment in Atlanta. I mean, it's spread out differently, but some areas you think would be natural, but Atlanta isn't what it seems to be there. Manufacture and launch, if I understand it, are experiencing the largest growth of all these segments. Do you see that continuing, and how do you see the market playing out with respect to heavier rockets and the emergence of small launch vehicles?
That's a really, really good question. So there is going to be a large-scale turnover over the next couple of years. We're actually already seeing a start of it now on the heavier vehicle side. So we're seeing, traditional and kind of already established launcher actors kind of phasing out their veteran workhorse vehicles gradually over the next couple of years, and also replacing them gradually with new upgraded systems. So for example, that would be, Ariane 5 is being slowly and gradually replaced by Ariane 6. We're seeing, new vehicles like Northrop Grumman's Omega, another heavy launcher. ULA's Vulcan's coming to market, also quite a bit of them. So that's the heavier side. And now more on the small launch vehicles, we're seeing that there's also a huge push of new actors, as you know. I think I was at a presentation earlier today that cited, I think, 138 new launch vehicles all over the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
Graph that. It's a hockey stick. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah. In various stages of development that are coming to market. And, of course, they're all competing. We also know that SpaceX announced their new rideshare program yesterday, too, which is very, very exciting. So I think all of that points to the fact that, we're seeing a huge proliferation of small sats. There's definitely demand. The question is there enough demand? It's all made possible because of the growth and success of small sats and related technology, specifically on the dedicated small launcher side. If we are talking long-term, though, I think most of the new actors will not survive. Obviously, there's over 100. What's interesting to note, though, is that dedicated small sat launch vehicles will not be used for the constellations, the large-scale deployments of constellations, for the most part. It's hard to generalize, of course.
Earlier I mentioned Long Beach. Let's go to the other side, go to Atlantic. I was in Washington, D.C. about 3 weeks ago. I was at a Space Foundation workshop on cybersecurity. And I tell you, if I had a transcript, I'd have every other word would be China. It was like, wow, it was just... is there any other country out there to worry about China? And we look at hardware. China's launched a rocket from a sea platform. Are there advantages for commercial or government sea launch versus traditional land-based platforms?
I think the reason why you're hearing about China so much is that China has ramped up their launch cadence quite a bit over the last couple of years. And just to be clear, though, China is not the first to launch a rocket from a sea platform. We've seen that before with Sea Launch, which has now been sold to, I think, a Russian group called S7. But yes, so there are many, many advantages to launching from the sea. I mean, the biggest really drawback of launching from the traditional kind of land-based platform is just being geographically confined to an area. And so then you're limited to a specific range of orbits that you can launch into. And so if you have a mobile platform that you can literally move to wherever you need to hit a specific orbit, I think that gives you that flexibility. Also, being geographically confined can lead to some schedule delays as well, scarce resources and all of that. So now, if we're talking about the customer side, so for the commercial side, being not limited to specific orbit, I think is really, really important. But for governments, the biggest advantage, that's the most actually attractive, is more of having the ability to launch stealthily or more stealthily than before. And so currently right now, if you're launching from land, basically everybody can see what you're doing. You're rolling out to the launch pad, you kind of can make some assumptions of what you're launching, what orbit, et cetera, so on. And so having that mobility, I think, increases the flexibility of launch. And we're seeing that as kind of a new trend perpetuated by the small sat dedicated launch vehicle industry.
You've published a lot of articles for being a young person. I mean, it's really a tribute to your hard work. And you've written that long-term growth will depend on government support as well as legal and regulatory requirements coming together to facilitate market expansion. Now, this is true for railroads and agriculture and everything else. So explain to our listeners here what coming together means from a small sat perspective.
One of my favorite topics. I think it's important to note that everyone in the industry would agree, actually, that this is a really highly regulated industry. And so, sure, governments play a role of regulators, but that's not the only thing that they do. The role of governments now is regulatory. They're also participants, customers, enablers, facilitators. So really all actors are really, really intertwined in space. And so market expansion benefits all. And because of this, there really must be alignment and government support, which includes having supporting regulations that enable instead of kind of stifle innovation. And so I'll, bring back the example of China. The reason why China has been able to accelerate their development is because of lowering regulatory barriers to facilitate technology transfer between their military and commercial sectors. And so they were able to accelerate their rate of launch.
Because of that, yeah, that's interesting. Let's go from regulation to application. Earth observation has been the most notable and successful small sat application. I'm beginning to hear more and more buzz about in or on-orbit servicing, like refueling and life extension and salvage. Do these represent some of the newer applications?
I think that's definitely a very hot topic in the industry as well. What we're going to be seeing by end of year is Northrop Grumman's launch of their first mission. It's called MEV-1. They're going to be servicing an Intelsat satellite in GEO. However, both of those are not small sats. But there are other actors who are trying to get into this space as well. There's Effective Space, who will be utilizing the small sat form factor to service other satellites, and they're looking at life extension and other things.
Leena, thousands of people from all over the world are listening to this podcast. I know a few people come up to me at the show and tell me. If you are listening and like to get email alerts when new episodes are available, go to Google, type in Constellations Podcast, and you'll come up on the site and click on Kratos and give us your email, and we'll send you off announcements, maybe when you're on a guest again, so who knows. So I want you to put on your technology hat now. Take off the government hat and your application hat and put on technology hat. One of the problems that I see with small sats is without internal propulsion capability, they can't move, and that means new propulsion systems have to come online. Is that true? And what new is available in the propulsion area?
That's true for the most part. And I think, developing propulsive capabilities, that's really another one of those enabling technologies that are going to unlock a lot of new capabilities for small sats. So we're seeing a trend of small sats kind of moving to GEO, whereas they used to be more confined to lower orbits. There also are restraints on small sats, specifically that are propulsion. So there will be easier kind of maneuverability, faster reaction times, and that will enable a lot of different interesting, cool things. And so also having to put less propulsion on propellant on the bus itself, you're not as constrained by volume anymore. You're able to utilize more payload space, and so kind of add more capability to that as well.
In DC there's an acronym, and it's called SME, Subject Matter Expert. And I know you're not a subject matter expert on ground systems. I want to get your perspective, because you're pretty well rounded and you're kind of up with what's going on with this. When you look at mega constellations like OneWeb and SpaceX, what impact do you think they'll have on ground systems operations?
Sure. So that's a really good question. And the ground segment is very, very important, as you noted, to support the operations in space. It also makes up a really big part of the CapEx for all constellations. And so OneWeb and SpaceX, I believe their first generation sats are not going to have intersatellite links. So they're very, very important to build out the ground infrastructure all over the world. So this means at least higher costs and higher CapEx, at least initially. Later on, of course, it will probably, as technology develops, the prices will go down. But still, it's a big deal, and it's something that's needed as well.
This is the Constellations Podcast. We've probably interviewed 50 or 60 people, and we've done a couple of interviews on phased array antennas and different types of antenna technology. And we see a lot of innovation even in that. Do you think they'll have an impact on small sats?
Yes, absolutely.
Leena, let's assume at least one of the proposed major constellations is successful. what impact will they have on large satellite operators?
That's a very good question, although it's very difficult to answer. It's hard to generalize, again, about all constellations. Each situation is unique, just like basically everywhere in the industry. But I think for the most part, they will complement larger satellite operators for the most part. I truly don't believe that GEOs are going to go away for sure, but cannibalization of certain revenue streams will occur eventually somewhat. An interesting trend that we're seeing is operators beginning to trend towards using kind of hybrid architectures, which are, bigger birds in GEO using others. So having satellites in different orbits and working together, right? So complementary. An example of this is JSAT and Hispasat and strategic partnerships with LEOSat and things like that. So use of hybrid architectures allows them to kind of hedge their bets somewhat, and that's a good thing too.
I have a friend named Claude whose son may not be able to go to Mars because of space debris blocking any kind of satellites from going on. And so we got debris out there, we got the risk of collision today. All of a sudden, we're increasing the number of satellites because of smallsats. These are increasing a lot of standard industry concerns, isn't it?
Yes, there is concern. This is another hot topic right now. I believe you heard Greg Weiler in his opening keynote, talk about being a good space operator and talking about sustainability as well. And so there are companies that are within the space situational awareness space, SSA company, but they do need some support of the government. There are a lot of actors across the industry that believe that this is more of a later problem, not a now problem. And there's not very much right now that's motivating them to update what they're using now for space situational awareness. So, and this is another one of those examples where we talk about, the industry needs to come together and really support each other, where other stakeholders may need to incentivize satellite operators to, rely on these other new methods. And there's definitely a need for that. So.
Leena, you've been here a couple of days. I think you've gone to a lot of visited booths. You've heard the keynote. You've heard a lot of presentations here. And maybe you're able to take a look and get a handle on, where this is going to project out in those 4 or 5 years. Maybe where are the opportunities and where are the pitfalls. I mean, we could have an event where there's going to be a lot of trouble coming up in the future. So looking down the road, challenges and opportunities and pitfalls, where do you see?
I think I'm very, very biased. My love is launch, so I'll constantly be keeping my eyes on, the development of the new dedicated smallsat launchers, lighter launchers, just rockets in general. But, there are other emerging applications that I find very, very exciting and very thrilling, and I think they are opportunities. One we mentioned, it's in-orbit servicing and specifically sophisticated robotic manipulation, that capability that is not, currently mature enough, but it's still a little bit farther out. But I think that one is something to look out for. Another really good application is, software-defined capabilities. I think that's very, very exciting and has a lot of potential. Inter-satellite links and more efficient use of spectrum capabilities, optical communications and things like that. And so, those are just some, but there are many exciting things coming in the industry.
Well, Leena, unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, Leena Pivovarova, analyst and consultant at NSR.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.